Hello and welcome to Into the Woods with Holly Wharton. This podcast is all about our journey into the woods of ourselves, getting to know who we are, where we are, and where we're going in life, so that we can create the life that we want to live. It's about deepening your connection with yourself, taking inspired action, and really trusting yourself and your intuition. It's also about mindset. Our beliefs are such an important part of this journey, and there are so many ways for us to change our mindset so that we can more easily live a life of expansive joy. This podcast is also about going literally into the woods and spending time in nature, and how that can help us on our own personal journey of self-knowledge. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now let's get into this week's episode. Hello, adventurers, and welcome to the Into the Woods podcast, episode 449. This is your host, Holly Wharton, and I'm back with another exciting guest. I am super excited to introduce this week's guest, Dr. Wendy Morrison. Now, I've been mildly obsessed with Hillforts ever since I walked the Ridgeway National Trail back in 2016. And my obsession only deepened when I walked the trail a second time in 2020, and I was inspired to visit all the Hillforts near the Ridgeway. I actually wrote a couple of blog posts on the topic. One is Hillforts on the Ridgeway, and the other one is Hillforts near the Ridgeway. And I really enjoyed researching these blog posts because they involved visiting these sites, some of which I'd already been to, some of which I had only seen on maps and never been to. And it felt really adventurous to identify these sites that I wanted to visit and then go see them. Now, I feel such an indescribable connection to Hillforts, and I don't know why. Is it this sensation that I'm walking in the shadows of ancient people? Is it something spiritual? Well, Dr. Morrison and I discussed this and more. I don't know whether you've heard of Hillforts before or whether you've experienced Hillforts. We talk about this in the episode, but they're basically Iron Age earthworks that were built for various reasons, and Wendy gets into those details in the episode. So I hope this episode inspires you to either get out and visit your local Hillforts or other ancient sites, depending on where you are in the world. I think that combining history and archaeology with our outdoor adventures is a really fascinating way to get outdoors and engage with history, with the people who have walked this land hundreds and thousands of years before us. I just think it's just really enriching and fascinating, and I hope you're inspired by this episode. So who is Dr. Wendy Morrison? Dr. Wendy Morrison currently works for the Chilterns Conservation Board as project manager of the NLHF-funded Beacons of the Past Hillforts project. She is also senior associate tutor for archaeology at the Oxford University Department for Continuing Education. She's the chair of the Hillfort Study Group and president of the Marlow Archaeology Group. She has over a decade's excavation experience in southern Britain, the Channel Islands, and India, and is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. So what are you going to learn in this episode? We talk about what are Hillforts and why should we care about them. We discuss why there's no such thing as a typical Hillfort. They're really, really varied. I thought I knew what they looked like, but I learned lots of new things in this episode. We also discussed where to find Hillforts in the landscape, the dangers to Hillforts in modern times, how we can help keep Hillforts and ancient sites safe, how to report heritage crime on ancient sites, and why we feel such a deep connection to Hillforts. So I hope you find this episode interesting and useful and inspiring, and I hope it inspires you to get outdoors and explore your local sites. So here's the episode. Hello, Wendy. How are you today?
Hi, I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
I'm great, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
It's Hillforts Wednesday on Twitter.
Oh, so perfect timing.
Appropriate time to re-recording.
Perfect timing. So I'm obsessed with Hillforts. I think part of it's because, I grew up in a different country where we didn't have them, at least not that I was aware of. And when I moved here to England 11 years ago, I just started walking and exploring these different trails and coming across Hillforts. And I just became really fascinated by this ancient history that we have. And I love it so much. So let's start out by defining what are Hillforts? Like, can you describe a typical Hillfort? What is it?
That's a really, really good and tricky question. Like you will find most questions in prehistory and Hillforts in particular are tricky with their answers. To define a hill fort, we're stuck with that term because it's a bit of baggage that's come down through the years to define a whole range of prehistoric enclosures. And so you would think from a name like Hillfort, it means that they're always on the tops of hills and that they are heavily fortified and would have been used for defense. But in reality, of all the hill forts that we have, there are a huge number of them that aren't on top of hills, and also huge numbers that show no evidence of having attacks and violence and defense at them. So once we've stripped away hill and fort, what are we left with if we're trying to define these things? We could just call them later prehistoric enclosed spaces, but I think we've decided that we'll just hang on to hill fort, even though it's not 100% the perfect term for it. And it comes about largely, I think, because some of the earliest archaeologists and antiquarians who were observing these features were also military men. And so they saw these sorts of ditch and bank rampart enclosures and thought, yes, that's the sort of fortification I would build as a military person. So this must be a fort. And if we look at some of the names of hill forts around the country, we can also see where some of that military-minded interpretation fed into building a false narrative for them. So some of our hill forts are called Caesar's Camp, because people think that they were constructed, by Caesar or by the locals against Caesar. Some of them are called things with Dane in the title, like Danesfield Camp or Danebury. And these, again, were early archaeologists, early antiquarians looking at this and saying, these must have been thrown up as defenses either by the Danes or against the Danes in those attacks. And the reality is these monuments, these earthwork enclosures, go much further back than the Danes and certainly much further back than Caesar as well. So they're going back into the late Bronze Age into the Middle Iron Age. So we're talking about a period from about, at least in this southern part of the country, 1100 BC to around 300 BC, probably is sort of the tail end of that hill fort construction period.
Okay. So what would be a typical hill fort? When you think of, obviously, as you said, they're on hills, they're not on hills, but what's a typical hill fort? Like, how would you know you're on one?
Right. Well, given that they range from, and this is just in the Chilterns now, I'm just talking in my particular area where I work, they range in size from about 10 hectares and having multiple enclosed earthworks, right down to being under a hectare, really, really tiny, or with single earthworks. So, as I say, there's not any one particular way to define them.
Okay.
But I think if I had to be pressed to it, and I sense you are, I would say they are significant places in the landscape, whether that's because they're a place of prominence because of their elevation or because of their location to, for instance, some of water courses, chalk streams or chalk springs, whether they are located at route nodes between trackways where people are coming and going. It will be some place of significance, some place of prominence in the landscape, not always a hilltop. And they will be enclosed by ditch and bank earthworks. Those are the two sort of defining characteristics of this category of monument.
And earthworks, for people who might not know, that's places where ancient people have moved the earth to create formations.
Right.
How would you define that?
An earthwork is exactly that. Earth has been moved.
Yes.
And so the ditches and banks that enclose these sites were constructed in a very, very simple way, very straightforward. You dig into the earth and create a ditch. And all of the arisings that are created from digging that ditch out, the spoil, if you will, that gets piled up to create the bank. Now, in some cases, you can imagine if you just piled up earth and left it, in a few years, it would erode away and fill back up the ditch. So in some cases, we have good evidence for what they called box ramparts. And this is where you would basically put on a whole bunch of post holes and build a timber set of boxes to hold back that spoil, to hold it in place until it could consolidate. And so we sometimes see evidence of that in excavations. So you dig out this great big ditch. And here in the Chilterns, again, relatively easy work. You might be digging through gravels and chalks. In other parts of the country, they're hacking through stone. It's really, really, really hard work. But you make this ditch and you throw the arisings up into your rampart. So that's creating the elevated earthwork. And the combination of those two things encloses your space quite handily. And whether that's for keeping livestock in, for keeping the neighbors out, there's a variety of function these hill forts would have served. But the first step is enclosing that space. And many of these banks, once they're created, may have had wooden fences or palisades sometimes built on top of them as well.
Okay. So how did you learn so much about hill forts? What is your area of expertise? How did you get into this?
Well, I don't like the word expertise at all, because particularly in archaeology, because we're always learning, and one new excavation can overturn everything that we thought we knew. So I don't ever like to use the word expert or expertise. My passion for prehistory comes from the great unknown of it all.
Yeah.
And Hillforts are such an important part of Iron Age life. They sort of dominate a lot of the narratives. So some of our greatest excavations have been on Hillforts. And indeed, my archaeological mentor is Professor Sir Barry Cunliffe. I studied under him at Oxford. And he did one of the greatest Hillfort excavations in the country at Danebury, where over 30% of the interior of an Iron Age Hillfort was excavated over the course of decades.
Wow.
It's a great repository of knowledge and understanding of Iron Age Hillforts, and still, even to this day, is being going back to and questioned and reinterrogated. But studying under Barry, I became really, really interested in what we think about Hillforts, what we know, what we don't know, and how varied they are. There's absolutely no way that we can say one particular story about Hillforts, full stop. There's a survey that was done of all the Hillforts in the UK and Ireland. So Professor Gary Locke and Professor Ian Ralston have just published the Atlas of the Hillforts. And there are over 4,000 entries in that atlas. 4,000 Hillforts between the UK and Ireland. And they vary in size, they vary in function, they vary in location. And they're just such an interesting feature in the landscape and in the way that they were used in all these varied ways that I've just sort of always been drawn to them.
And so how are they distributed throughout Britain? Are they all across the island? Are there more in the south? Where are they?
There are denser concentrations in some places than others. In fact, here in the Chilterns, we have the 10th densest concentration of anywhere in the country. If anyone's familiar with the Dorset chalk landscapes, they will know places like Maiden Castle and Poundbury and Hod Hill, some really famous Hillforts. There's a very dense concentration there. But there are all over the country, in Wales, in Scotland, even on the Isle of Man. So they're all over the place. And they're constructed in various different ways, but that's often dictated by the geology in which they find themselves and in the groups of people that were actually building them. But they are ubiquitous. They're not just unique to the United Kingdom and Ireland either. They're all over northwestern Europe.
That was my next question. So they have been found over northwestern Europe. Are they also found in other parts of the world, or is this mostly a European thing?
Well, the Hillforts, as we're discussing these Iron Age Hillforts that fall in within this time period, within this sort of wide Northwest Europe, I hate to use the word cultural package, but within that sort of scope, the Hillforts stretch from, as I say, from Ireland right the way through to this Hillforts in Poland. So we have a variety of that fit broadly within that same temporal period and are probably filling a lot of those same forms and functions. On the other side of the world, there is a set of archaeological features which I was lucky enough to visit 2 years ago in New Zealand. And these are much later in date and obviously are being built by the Maori people. They have nothing to do with our Iron Age Hillforts and yet look almost exactly like them in form and possibly in function. So I was very fortunate to be able to go to New Zealand right before the first lockdown, got back just beforehand, and meet with archaeologists in New Zealand and look at these Hillforts. And what was really interesting was the latest of these Hillforts were constructed at the end of the 19th century. And so to be able to talk to people whose great-grandfathers had constructed a Hillfort was a wonderful thing for me, because that's something that clearly I'll never be able to do with my own Hillforts. But there was a lot to be learned there about the same requirements of the landscape being put to use in the same ways by completely different groups of people.
Wow, that's fascinating. So how do we know how old these Hillforts are? Have you done carbon dating on items that have been found within them? How does that work?
A lot of our Hillforts we haven't got good tight dates from, and we estimate the date based on what we would call their morphology or their shape, their size, their location. If we have good dates for one, and then we find another Hillfort that looks kind of like that, we make the assumption that very likely this other Hillfort falls into that date range. You can't actually know until you put a hole in it and find something that you can actually date. Okay. So the best dating for a Hillfort would be to get something that you could get a good radiocarbon date within the rampart, within that earthwork, something that was sort of trapped in between the basket loads of spoil that's being shoveled up, because that tells you when it was constructed. Right. Excavating inside the Hillfort only gives you a date for at some point when somebody was doing something in there. So it could be a week after they finished the Hillfort. It could be 500 years after they finished the Hillfort. So you can see that dating can be quite a tricky thing.
Absolutely.
We do have some really good dates for some of the Hillforts, and those are down to excavation. But a lot of them, it is guesswork. And that's information to be filled in from time to time with more excavation and more investigation. One of the hill forts that I just recently excavated on last October was a place called Seven Ways Plain in Burnham Beeches, which is just to the north of Slough. And this is a hill fort for which we didn't have any good dating at all. And I was very lucky to have found a piece of charcoal inside the layers of gravel that make up the earthwork defense. So those that will be going off to the lab, and fingers crossed, we'll get a reasonable date range. Radiocarbon dating isn't one of those things where you get a result back in the envelope and it says, this was 2,112 years ago on Monday. And particularly the Iron Age has a whole bunch of different variations, which make it quite tricky to get a tight date. But we should be able to get a window that narrows it down, gives us a better date than, you'll remember I mentioned a few minutes ago that the range is from about 1100 BC up to about 300 BC. This should tighten that down considerably within a couple of centuries.
Okay. So, as you said, these hill forts were made for different purposes. Do we have any idea who made them and what for?
Well, it more than likely is going to be the people that are living and working around the locations of these hill forts. So whilst we often see the reconstruction of a hill fort as being stuffed with roundhouses, a bustling little town on top of the hill, and indeed some sites do show evidence that they were filled with roundhouses, a lot of them don't. And so it may well be that the people who are constructing these are living and working in the landscape around the hill fort, and that the building of the hill fort is a communal effort, a display of community status and pride that can be seen from lots of different places. It may be that they're being used as places of what we call seasonal aggregation, which is just a fancy way of saying getting together once a year in the spring or something like that, for the hosting of fairs. They might be for places of refuge in those few instances where there might be interpersonal violence. You might want to flee up into the hill fort. They could be places where people bring all their stock together. So, there's a variety of uses of the monuments, but I think the one sort of standout thing is that it is probably the local people constructing these as a statement of their dominance, but their influence on the landscape around them.
Okay. And why did people stop making them? Did they move on to different types of dwellings, or what happened?
I think what probably, and again, we don't know, but I think it's not so much moving into different types of dwellings. As I say, in many cases, these probably aren't being lived in. I think it comes down to different ways of expressing that impact on the landscape. And as time moves on and people are coming into contact with a lot of different influences, particularly in the later Iron Age, they're opening up to a lot of continental influences. We start to see the impact of trade with the Roman world much earlier than the conquest period. We see a lot of interaction, particularly in southern Britain. I think people are just learning that or discovering new ways to express that kind of communal identity or that sort of impact on the landscape. And it may well be that power systems are shifting as well, too. So going from smaller communities that are holding certain areas of influence in the landscape to larger, well, certainly what comes down to us through Roman histories as tribal entities that seem to be much larger chunks of the landscape and different systems of social control. So I think it's a changing world as we head into the later Iron Age, and that's reflected in what's being constructed in the land.
And were hill forts ever reused in more recent historical times, many years after they were originally constructed, or were they just kind of left?
Again, that's a really, really good question. Some of them do show evidence of having been used, both in the early Roman period, again, also in the medieval period. Some of them indeed have been left. It runs the whole gamut, really. It just depends on their location, how significant that location is to subsequent generations of people living in the land.
And what about standing stones or stone circles? Do they ever coincide with hill forts, or are they usually separate?
So that's a phenomenon that goes further back in time by several millennia. What we do see, particularly in this area, in the Chilterns in the southeast, we see a coincidence or at least a respect for a lot of Bronze Age funerary monuments. So these we often see barrows either near or enclosed by hill forts. We also do sometimes see evidence of earlier Neolithic activity, but in this case, more like causewayed enclosures being built into a hill fort. I'm thinking of it, Maiden Bower at Tottenham, or there's some evidence of a long barrow inside of Gerard's Cross, Bulstrode Camp. It's not so much a continuity of the use of space, I wouldn't have thought. I think it's more of the factors that made that significant in the Neolithic period or significant for burial location in the Bronze Age are also the sorts of things that make it desirable as a location when it comes to build these larger enclosures.
That makes sense. Are any hill forts endangered, or are they kind of in danger of being, I don't know, obviously there's erosion, but do they ever get kind of destroyed by modern people, or are these protected sites?
Most of the hill forts are scheduled, which
Mhm.
means they are protected by Historic England, and it is a prosecutable offence to do damage to them, including illicit metal detecting or
Ooh.
riding your mountain bikes up and over the top of the
Ooh.
ramparts. So they are protected, but unfortunately, a lot of that times that protection can't actually be enforced. They're in
Yeah.
very remote rural areas, and they do suffer quite a bit from that sort of what we call heritage crime. The other threats they face, of course, are sometimes even if you are a scheduled monument, if the money's big enough, the development goes ahead anyway. And so there are aspects of some development around the country that are impinging on some hill forts. And then on the flip side of that, you have them, you mentioned erosion, you have some of them being absolutely loved to death. So there's a site in the Chilterns called Ivanhoe Beacon, amazing site. If you haven't been, I encourage you to go. Lovely site, fantastic vistas. It's our oldest hill fort in the Chilterns, pretty good date to about 1050 BC, and managed beautifully by National Trust. But it sees an awful lot of visitors. And if you approach Ivanhoe Beacon, the first thing you really notice before you even see the hill fort is the long white scar into the chalk, which is the footpath of people walking up. And that's something that it's very bad for the landscape, that sort of level of erosion. It's just getting worse and worse. I mean, especially over the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of visitor increase in these sorts of places, people wanting to get outside. And that scar has widened from about 3 meters wide to about 8 meters wide.
Oh, wow.
So one of the things that my project is working with the National Trust and with Historic England on is a way to sort of mitigate that erosion and try to find a way to make a more robust and permanent footpath so that people can still get to the top and enjoy the view and being in the hill fort and understanding the hill fort, but without doing quite so much damage. But it is a constant challenge to get that balance right between encouraging people to come out and enjoy the hill fort and their settings, but also wanting to protect the hill fort from exactly that level of attention.
I know. So what can visitors do to help keep these places safe?
Well, they can keep an eye out for anything that looks like it shouldn't be happening on a hill fort. If people are metal detecting on a hill fort, that's almost 100% guaranteed to be not the right thing to be doing. If they see people setting fires on the hill fort or doing any sort of damage, I would encourage them to call 101 and let their local police know. But for the wider scope of how can the average person help look after a hill fort, it's about awareness, really. One of the other big problems that we have on hill forts that I didn't mention is fly tipping. For some reason, a ditch and a bank seems like a perfect place to throw all your sofas and mattresses. I think a lot of times these sites, they are so rural or remote that they are not appreciated and understood. And if people just understood what the hill forts were and why they were there and how lucky they are to have something like this in their landscape, this wonderful piece of heritage, I think possibly they'd be looked after better. So the idea is just sort of spread the word, spread the love. Hill forts are fantastic. They're millennia old monuments in the landscape. They were special to the people who built them, and they should be special to us as well.
Hill forts, obviously you're approaching them from a scientific perspective, well, not scientific, but historical, ancient, archaeological perspective. Do you ever come across people who approach hill forts from kind of a magical or spiritual perspective? Do you have any experience with that?
Absolutely. I mean, the word that gets used most commonly when I'm out doing walks on hill forts or taking people around them or just talking to people that I run into on these hill forts, the word that comes up very often is ethereal.
Yeah.
They have this sort of this impact on people. They just sort of feel something special about the place.
Yes.
And whilst I don't ascribe to any of that sort of feeling about the nothing sort of preternatural going on, but I certainly don't disparage it if other people do feel that way about them. It's a very personal connection to any sort of landscape.
Yeah.
I feel quite touchy-feely about rivers. I feel sort of, and I hesitate to use the spiritual word because I'm not a spiritual person, but that kind of deeper connection to certain places. So if people feel that in a stone circle or on a hill fort, or, I certainly am not one to disparage it. I think it has very much to do with people connecting to a place in the landscape. Yeah. We all have a visceral connection to nature, and whether that's forested places, going, I think they call it tree bathing, going into wooded places, or going to places where there's running water, or going up onto high places where ancient people have spent a lot of time and energy. I think we all have a connection to something in the natural world. And if it's archaeological, that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's interesting because that was actually one of the questions I wanted to ask you. Because whenever I visit hill forts, I get this really deep sense of connection to the land. Don't know whether it's because I know that I'm walking in a place where ancient people have lived. And communed. And I just feel such a connection to them. It's like there's something special there, and I have no words to describe it.
That's the experience, isn't it? It's that being in a location where you know that there's been that sort of directed input from people from so long ago and that it was special to them. And it sort of maybe hangs around the place. I don't know. I think as an archaeologist, because I see that sort of evidence everywhere, it's not just in the Hillfort. The Hillforts don't exist in isolation. They're just a part of a very much wider conversation with the landscape that people have been having in this part of the country for 8,000 years or more. And because I see that sort of everywhere, I kind of feel that connection everywhere, if you see what I mean, but without perhaps that sort of, I don't know, special walking in their shadow sort of feel. But yes, I mean, humans have had an impact on the landscape from the minute they set foot at that point in time, connected Britain. The evidence is everywhere.
Yeah, it is. I think it's just most of us don't know how to see it, or we don't know where to look. And when I go to places like the Ridgeway, which is so full of Hillforts and other ancient sites, that's where like I just feel such a connection to, as you said, walking in the shadows of the people that have walked here before us. It's just really, really special.
And I think that's lovely because it draws you into wanting to learn more about those people. And, you know, you can sort of go down a rabbit hole of exploration. A simple walk along the Ridgeway will make you want to learn more and more about all the different levels of the time periods, the time strata that's gone on from there, from people walking along, perhaps even in the Neolithic, right the way through to medieval traders tromping along to people that walked yesterday before you got there. You know, it's a fantastic human story.
Absolutely. So do you have a favorite Hillfort?
Ooh.
Top 3?
I do have a favourite Hillfort, but it's not in the Chilterns, so it's quite embarrassing. My favourite Hillfort is Yevering Bell, which is in Northumberland. A fantastic site at the Millfield Basin. But if I'm going to come closer to home, my favourite Chilterns Hillfort, I think I really, really love Pulpit Hill. It's very, very small. It has a beautiful view of the Aylesbury Vale, very nice ramparts, and we don't know an awful lot about it. I hate to use the word cute, but it is a cute Hillfort. Yes, I very much like walking through there.
Yeah, very lovely. Yes, I've definitely visited there, but only once. So it's just a place I need to return to. So you mentioned before we got on the call that you work for a project called Beacons of the Past. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely, yes. So I work for the Chilterns Conservation Board, and they've hosted a national lottery heritage-funded project called Beacons of the Past. It started back in 2018, and it's in its final year now. So I'm the project manager on that. And for the first 3 years of it, I had my colleague, Dr. Ed Pevler, alongside me for that project. And together, we basically worked to bring the Hillforts of the Chilterns further into the sort of the spotlight, as it were. As I said, one of the best ways to protect these monuments is to make sure that people know more about them. And we commissioned the largest archaeological high-resolution LiDAR survey ever flown in the UK. So we did a LiDAR survey of the entire Chilterns, plus lots of extra areas outside the Chilterns AONB. And that's allowed us to identify loads of new archaeology, one new Hillfort, but loads of new archaeology across all time periods. And that's still ongoing. We've been doing a lot of work with citizen science. So if any of your listeners are interested particularly in that sort of thing, I would encourage them to go to the Chilterns AONB website and look for Beacons of the Past. We have all of that LiDAR publicly available for people to scroll around like on a Google Earth sort of interface and look at.
I am fascinated by all of the LiDAR images that I've been seeing online. So for people who don't know what that is, can you explain to us?
Yes, so think of it very simplistically as sort of laser scanning. So a light aircraft is flown over the Chilterns and bombarded everything with millions of laser points per minute. And every time that laser bounced off something, it went back up to the plane, to the receiver in the plane, and gave a very precise measurement. So laser measurements, millions per minute, flown over 1,400 square kilometers. There are 64 billion measurements in this point cloud. And that allows us to create a very, very accurate 3D digital model of the surface of the Earth, trees, buildings, you name it. And then that data is classified so that you can take different classifications and remove them. So we remove all the trees, we remove all the scrub vegetation, we remove the buildings. And what that leaves us with is an image of all the other humps and bumps that were under those trees. And so that has allowed us to see woodland archaeology in a way that just wasn't possible before because it was entirely too overgrown. And it's revealed loads of things about the Chilterns. As I say, one new Hillfort, dozens of new Iron Age and Roman settlement enclosures. We found World War I training trenches that had sort of slipped from view under vegetation, medieval enclosures, settlements, field systems. It's been fantastic.
And the new Hillfort that you mentioned, is that something that if someone visited there on foot, would they see it or not because it's under woodland?
It's completely under woodland, and I can't actually reveal where it is. Say it's in the southern Chilterns until we work out some sort of arrangement to have it looked after. In this instance, you wouldn't know it was there.
Wow. I think that's so fascinating. It's like there's so much still to learn about not just Hillforts, but just archaeology in general.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a very generous subject. As I say, there's been people doing things to the landscape for at least 8,000 years in this area. And that's just the sort of post-Holocene stuff. It's a very exciting sort of thing to be doing, is just peeling back those layers and finding out what people have been getting up to.
It is. And I think sometimes people think, oh, well, is there anything left to uncover? Or is there anything left to excavate? But I think now that we've got new technologies like LiDAR and probably other new things to come, there will be so much more because we have new ways of seeing things.
Absolutely. I think it was in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was somebody an archaeologist who had said something along the lines of just about everything has been discovered in Britain. And of course, we know that is completely untrue. And I think if you said that today, you'd find it was untrue in a couple hundred years as well. And you make a very good point about technology bringing new layers to things, because the way we used to excavate even 20 years ago has changed. We know that we can now ask a lot more things of an excavation than we ever used to, whether that's down to looking at ancient preserved pollen so that we can recreate the paleo environment of the time, or whether it's looking at tiny little charred grains of seed to find out what people were growing and what they were eating. There are things we can do now archaeologically that we couldn't have dreamt of, as I say, even 20, 30 years ago. So what does the future hold? That's why I'm always very much about not digging up everything now just because we can. Sometimes it's important just to hold off and wait a little bit.
Yeah. And I think that's really important because I see places like Silbury Hill that near Avebury that was excavated so many times. And now you can kind of see the erosion happening. And perhaps if we had just waited until we had this technology, obviously no one knew this technology was coming, but if we had waited to look through it now, maybe the hill would be in better shape.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you can't know what's going to come around the bend, but it's always good to save a portion of your excavation, if possible, in situ, just for people to see, be able to try new techniques later on down the road. It's an unrepeatable experiment, is an archaeological excavation. You can't go back and re-dig that thing you dug.
Yeah, because you've already touched it.
Excavation is destruction, and I think we need to be quite careful about where and when we do that destruction in search of our answers.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So are there any Hillforts in particular that you would suggest that people visit?
Well, with the proviso about the erosion, Ivinghoe definitely. That is an absolute corker. Again, I'm sort of limiting this to the Chilterns area, which I really shouldn't. But yes, Ivinghoe Beacon and Pulpit Hill, fantastic to visit. If you want to look at a contrasting large site, Wendover Wood, there's Boddington Camp in Wendover Wood, which is fantastic. If you're outside the Chilterns, I would highly recommend Castle Hill, which is Long Whitnam, sometimes known as the Whitnam Clumps. It's a fantastic view from there. If you're in Dorset, I would say go to Maiden Castle. It's the largest hill fort in all of northwestern Europe, and it is fantastic.
Lovely. So is there anything else that you want people to know about Hillforts that we haven't discussed?
Oh. No, just learn more about them. Come visit the web pages, learn about the Beacons of the Past project, have a look at what a Hillfort looks like on LiDAR. And if you're on Twitter, follow the hashtag Hillfort Wednesday. My colleague Miles Russell down at Bournemouth University, I think he started this, to be honest, this Hillfort Wednesdays thing. And it's taken off like mad. If you'll get your fill of Hillforts every Wednesday, your Twitter feed will be filled with pictures and stories and LiDAR, and it's a bit mental, but in a good way.
Yeah, I love it. And I've actually started following the Hillfort hashtag on Instagram, and it's just fascinating. I love it.
With more than 4,000 in the country, we've got plenty of material.
We'll never run out. So thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed learning about Hillforts, this thing that I love, and talking to you about it. So where can people find you online and learn more about what you do? So
you can visit the Chilterns Conservation Board's website, which is chilternsaonb.org, or the LiDAR site, which is chilternsbeacons.org. And I can be found on Twitter at Hillfortian. I love that. Perfect. Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, I really, really enjoyed it. And I hope to encourage people who are located in Britain or who visit to check out our beautiful Hillforts. Fantastic. Perhaps I'll see you out there on one. Yes. Thanks.
Please drop me a line and let me know what you thought of this week's episode. You can email me at holly@hollywharton.com or find me online and get in touch there. If you enjoyed this episode, you might want to check out these related episodes. 442, I talk with Cara Wilde about connecting with the land. 421, I talk with Cara Wilde about adventures with stone circles. 413, I have a solo show on the benefits of getting outdoors and how to get more from your adventures. 410, I discuss adding a new layer to your outdoor adventures. And finally, 376, I talk about long-distance walks, time and space to think and reflect. And that's when I talk about my 2020 walk along the Ridgeway. So, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a quick review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And remember to visit hollywharton.com/449 for the show notes on this episode. Happy trails. Thanks so much for listening to Into the Woods with Holly Wharton. You can find more information about today's episode, including links for topics that were discussed, at hollywharton.com. That's HOLLYWORTON.com. If you'd like to connect with other listeners and get support on your journey, I would love for you to join my private community on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Holly Wharton. That's patreon.com/Holly Wharton. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next week.